In the quiet hush of an early morning, long before the world learned to move quickly, there was a slower rhythm to life. The air felt softer then, as if time itself stretched gently across the land. In small towns and scattered villages, people woke not to alarms, but to the soft glow of dawn resting on wooden windowsills. A thin layer of mist often lingered over the fields. It moved slowly, drifting like a quiet thought that had not yet decided where to go. The roads were narrow, made of packed earth, and sometimes lined with simple fences or rows of trees that had stood for many years. Inside modest homes, the day began quietly. A kettle might be placed over a small fire. The sound of water warming was soft and steady, almost like a whisper. Wooden floors creaked gently as someone walked across the room. There were no bright lights, no sudden sounds, only the slow, familiar movements of people beginning another day. And somewhere, often in the back of a person's mind, there was a quiet thought. A letter might be coming. It was not a loud thought. It did not rush or demand attention. It simply rested there, like a distant memory or a soft hope. Letters did not come quickly in those days. They traveled slowly, carried by horses, wagons, and sometimes by tired hands that moved across long distances. Waiting for a letter was not just waiting for news, it was waiting for a piece of someone's voice. People understood this deeply, even if they never spoke it aloud. A letter could carry warmth across miles. It could bring comfort, or longing, or quiet joy. And so the waiting became part of life, woven gently into each day. A woman might stand by a small window, looking out at the road. The road did not change much from day to day. It stretched out into the distance, bending slightly as it followed the shape of the land. Sometimes a wagon would pass, sometimes a rider on horseback, but most of the time it remained still and empty. She would not stand there for long, just a moment, just enough to look. Then she would return to her work. There were always things to do, bread to knead, clothes to wash, floors to sweep. Life did not pause for waiting. It continued, steady and quiet. But the waiting remained. It moved with her, softly, like a shadow that did not disturb anything. In another place, perhaps many miles away, a man might be sitting at a small wooden table. A piece of paper rested in front of him. It was not perfectly smooth. The edges were slightly rough, and the surface carried the faint texture of its making. He held a pen, dipping it carefully into ink. Writing a letter was not something done quickly. Each word required attention. Each line took time. The ink flowed slowly, sometimes pausing, sometimes spreading just a little more than expected. He would think before he wrote, not because he had to, but because the letter would travel far and it would take time to arrive. Once it left his hands, it could not be changed, so he chose his words gently. He might write about small things, the weather, the way the wind had sounded the night before, the condition of the fields. He might mention a neighbor or a passing traveler, or a simple moment that would seem ordinary to anyone nearby, but meaningful to the person who would read it. Because letters were not only about important news, they were about presence. They were a way of saying quietly and without hurry, "I am here. I am thinking of you." When the letter was finished, he would fold it carefully. The paper made a soft sound as it bent. Then it would be sealed, perhaps with wax, perhaps simply closed and addressed. And then it would begin its journey. The journey was never fast. A letter might travel by horse, carried in a worn leather bag. The rider would move along long roads through changing landscapes. Fields would give way to forests. Forests might open into small towns where a few buildings stood close together. Sometimes the weather would shift. Rain could slow everything. The roads would soften, turning to mud. Wheels would sink slightly, and hooves would press deeper into the ground. Travel became slower, heavier. But still, the letters moved. They always moved, even if it took time. Back in the quiet homes, people continued their days. Morning would pass into afternoon. The light would change, growing warmer, then softer. Shadows would stretch across the ground, long and calm. And sometimes, in the distance, there would be a small movement, a figure on the road. It might not be nothing, just another traveler, but sometimes it was the one they had been quietly waiting for. The arrival of the post was not loud. There were no announcements, no sudden excitement. It was a gentle event, almost like the turning of a page. A rider might slow near a house. A small bag would be opened. Names would be checked carefully. And if there was a letter, it would be handed over with simple care. There were no dramatic gestures, just a quiet exchange. But in that moment, something shifted. The waiting, which had stretched softly across days, sometimes weeks, came to rest. A letter, once far away, was now close, held in the hands, felt in its weight, seen in the careful lines of handwriting on the outside. Some people opened their letters right away. Others waited. They might sit down first. They might take a breath. They might hold the letter for a moment longer, as if letting the feeling settle gently. Because opening a letter was not just reading words, it was stepping into someone else's presence. And that moment was often quiet, personal, and deeply felt. The paper would unfold slowly. The ink, now dry, would carry the shape of thoughts that had been written days or weeks before. Time lived inside those words, and as the reader moved from one line to the next, that time unfolded again, softly, like the pages of a memory. Outside, the world remained calm. The road stretched on. The wind moved gently through trees. And somewhere, far away, another letter was already beginning its journey.
The rhythm of waiting did not end with one letter. It began again, almost immediately, though in a softer way. Once a letter had been read, its words lingered in the mind, like the fading warmth of a fire after the flames had quieted. People often read their letters more than once. They would fold them carefully and place them somewhere safe, a small wooden box, perhaps, or tucked between the pages of a book. Some kept them close, within reach, returning to them in quiet moments. The paper would grow softer over time. The creases would deepen. The ink might fade just slightly, but the meaning remained clear. And with each reading, the voice within the letter seemed to return, not loudly, not suddenly, but gently, like a familiar presence sitting nearby. In the days that followed, life continued in its steady way. There were meals to prepare, fields to tend, clothes to mend. The seasons moved slowly, each bringing its own quiet changes. In the spring, the ground softened and new growth appeared. In the summer, the air grew warm and still. Autumn carried a gentle coolness, and winter wrapped everything in a slower, quieter pace. Through all of this, letters remained part of life, not constant, not frequent, but always there in the background. Waiting for a letter became a kind of quiet habit. It did not take over the day. It did not interrupt the work that needed to be done. Instead, it rested alongside everything else, like a steady, unspoken rhythm. A person might pause for a moment while working, just for a second. They might look toward the road, or think of a place far away, or remember the last letter they received. Then they would return to what they were doing. There was no urgency, because there could not be. Time moved differently then. News traveled slowly, and people understood that. They did not expect immediate answers. They did not expect quick replies. Instead, they learned to live within the space between letters. And in that space, something quiet and thoughtful grew. Patience. Not forced, not practiced, but natural. A kind of patience that came from knowing that some things simply take time. Writing a reply to a letter was often done with care. It was not rushed. A person might think about it for a day or even longer. They might carry the thoughts with them as they went about their tasks, what to say, how to say it, what small details to include. Because small details mattered, they were the threads that connected distant lives. A simple sentence about the way the morning light looked, or the sound of rain on a roof, could travel far and settle gently in someone else's day. When the time came to write, the process was familiar. Paper placed on a table, ink prepared carefully, the pen held with steady hands, words forming slowly, one after another. Sometimes there were pauses, moments when the writer would stop, look out a window, or simply sit quietly, letting the next thought come. There was no need to hurry. The letter would take its time, just as all letters did. And once it was finished, the same gentle ritual followed, folding the paper, sealing it, addressing it with care, and then letting it go. There was a quiet feeling in that moment, a mix of calm and distance. The letter, once close and personal, was now on its way into the wider world, carried along roads that stretched far beyond what the writer could see. Days would pass, sometimes many days, and during that time, the letter moved steadily forward, through towns where people lived their own quiet lives, past fields where work continued from sunrise to sunset, along roads where travelers came and went, each with their own purpose. The letter became part of that movement, a small, silent passenger. It did not speak, it did not rush, but it carried something important, a voice, a thought, a connection. And somewhere at the end of its journey, someone would be waiting, not standing still, not watching every moment, but holding that quiet awareness, that soft, steady thought. A letter might be coming. The waiting continued, gentle and patient, as the world moved slowly around it.
The days continued to pass in their quiet, unhurried way. Morning light would return again and again, touching the same rooftops, the same fields, the same narrow roads that stretched gently through the land. Each day looked similar to the one before, yet never exactly the same. Small differences appeared in the way the clouds moved or how the air felt against the skin. And within this steady passage of time, the waiting for letters settled deeper into daily life. It became something almost unnoticeable, not forgotten, but softened. A man might step outside just after sunrise, the ground still cool beneath his boots. The air would carry a faint scent of earth and wood smoke. He might pause for a moment before beginning his work, not because he expected anything to happen, but because stillness itself was a natural part of the morning. His eyes might drift toward the road. It lay quiet, unchanged, no movement, no rider, just the gentle curve disappearing into the distance. He would nod slightly, not in disappointment, but in quiet acceptance. Then he would turn back to his work, his thoughts settling again into the rhythm of the day. Inside homes, the same gentle patterns repeated, the sound of cloth being folded, the steady motion of hands preparing food, the soft scrape of a chair moving across a wooden floor. Nothing rushed, nothing sharp. Even the passing of time felt smooth, like water flowing slowly around stones. Letters, in their absence, became something almost imagined. People would remember the last one they had received. They would recall certain lines, certain words, sometimes even the way the handwriting curved across the page. Those memories stayed close, filling the quiet space between one letter and the next. In the afternoon hours, when the sun stood higher and the air grew still, there was often a deeper kind of calm. Work slowed slightly. Movements became more measured.
A person might sit for a short while, resting in the shade, letting their thoughts drift without direction. And in those moments, the idea of a letter might return more clearly, not as a need, not as a worry, just as a presence, a soft awareness that somewhere, perhaps already written, perhaps already traveling, there were words meant for them. Far away, those words continued their journey. A letter might now be resting in a small post office. These places were often simple. A single room, sometimes attached to another building, a counter made of wood, worn smooth by years of use, shelves or compartments where letters were sorted carefully, each piece of mail handled with quiet attention. The postmaster or whoever tended to the letters worked without haste. There was a rhythm to the sorting, a gentle placing of envelopes into their proper spaces, a glance at names, a quiet recognition of places both near and far. Some letters would stay there for a short while, waiting for the next part of their journey. Others would be collected by riders who came and went at regular, steady intervals. These riders were familiar figures. They moved along their routes with a calm sense of purpose, not hurried, not delayed, simply moving forward as they always did. Their horses carried them across long stretches of land. The sound of hooves against the ground was steady and even, not loud, not sudden, just a quiet, repeating rhythm that blended into the natural sounds of the world. Sometimes they passed through small towns where people would glance up briefly, recognizing the sight. There was no need to ask where the rider was going. Everyone understood. Letters were always moving, always traveling, always connecting distant lives in quiet, unseen ways. Back in the homes of those who waited, evening would slowly arrive. The light would soften, turning golden, then dim. Shadows would lengthen and stretch across the ground. The air would cool, carrying the gentle sounds of the end of the day. A door closing softly, footsteps slowing, the faint crackle of a fire being lit. Evening was often the time when letters were read again. After the work was done, after the day had settled, a person might take out a letter they had received days before. They would open it carefully, as if the act itself required a certain quiet respect. The paper, now familiar, would unfold with a soft sound, and once again the words would be there, waiting, not changed, not new, but still carrying the same presence. Reading a letter in the evening felt different. The mind was calmer. The world outside had grown quieter. Each word seemed to settle more deeply, as if there was more space for it to be heard. A sentence might be read slowly, then read again, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it held something gentle and meaningful. And when the letter was folded again, the feeling did not disappear. It remained, soft and steady, like a quiet warmth that stayed even after the fire had burned low. Night would come without urgency. Darkness would settle gradually, covering the land in a calm, even stillness. Windows would grow dim, voices would soften, and eventually sleep would come. But even in sleep, the slow rhythm of letters continued. Far away, somewhere along a quiet road, a rider might still be traveling, the path ahead lit only by faint moonlight. The letter still safe, still moving forward, still carrying its quiet message across the distance.
There were days when no letters came at all. These days were not unusual. They did not stand out sharply. They simply blended into the steady flow of time, like gentle pauses in a long, quiet melody. People did not mark these days with disappointment. Instead, they accepted them as part of the natural rhythm of things. A letter would come when it came, and until then, Life continued as it always had. In the early hours, before the sun fully rose, there was a special kind of stillness. The world seemed to hold its breath. The sky, just beginning to lighten, carried soft shades of gray and pale blue. Birds had not yet fully begun their morning songs. The air felt cool and untouched. In this stillness, a person might wake slowly. They might sit for a moment, listening to the quiet around them. No sounds from the road, no movement outside, just the calm presence of another day beginning. And in that quiet, the thought of letters remained gentle. It did not rush in. It did not demand attention. It simply existed somewhere in the background of the mind. As the day moved forward, the usual tasks returned. Water drawn from a well, wood gathered or arranged, simple meals prepared with steady, familiar motions. There was comfort in these routines. They did not change suddenly. They did not require new decisions. They allowed the mind to rest, even while the body worked. And within that rest, thoughts could drift softly, sometimes toward memories, sometimes toward distant places, sometimes toward the quiet possibility of a letter making its way through the world. Children, too, learned the rhythm of waiting. They saw it in the way adults lived, in the way a glance might be cast toward the road, in the way a letter was held, read, and kept. To them, letters were something almost magical, not because they appeared suddenly, but because they came from far away, from places they might never have seen, from people whose voices lived only in ink and paper. A child might ask about a letter, when it would come, who it would be from, and the answer was always calm. No one could say for certain. And that uncertainty was not troubling. It was simply the way things were. In the middle of the day, when the sun stood high and shadows grew short, the world often felt quiet in a different way, not still, but softened. Sounds carried less sharply, movements slowed, even the wind seemed to rest. During these hours, waiting felt lighter, less noticeable. The mind was occupied with the present moment, with the task at hand, with the simple act of being where one was. But as the day moved toward its later hours, something gentle shifted again. The light began to change, the air cooled, and with that change, awareness returned more clearly. The road, once unnoticed, became something to glance at again, not with urgency, just with quiet curiosity. A figure in the distance might appear, small at first, almost part of the landscape, then slowly more defined. A rider, or perhaps just a traveler. It was not always easy to tell, and so there was no sudden movement, no rushing to meet them, only a quiet watching, a gentle noticing. If it was the post, the moment unfolded slowly. The rider would approach at the same steady pace, the horse moving without hurry, the small bag of letters carried with care. There was a quiet familiarity to it all. No surprises, no changes, just the continuation of something that had happened many times before. And yet, each time it carried its own quiet meaning. A letter might be handed over, or there might be none. Both were accepted with the same calm, because waiting was not about the outcome. It was about the space in between, the soft passage of time, the gentle holding of possibility. And so, whether a letter arrived or not, the day moved on. Evening came, the light faded, and the quiet rhythm of life continued, steady and unbroken. far away, beyond sight and beyond knowing, more letters were being written. More words were being placed carefully onto paper. More journeys were beginning, slow and certain. And somewhere, someone would one day receive them, holding in their hands the quiet presence of another voice carried across time. There were certain days when the air itself seemed to carry a deeper sense of quiet. Not an empty quiet, but a full and gentle one, as if the world had settled into itself more completely. On such days, even the smallest sounds could be noticed more clearly. The faint brushing of leaves against one another, the distant call of a bird moving across the sky, the soft shifting of footsteps on packed earth. In these moments, waiting for a letter felt almost like part of the air, not separate from life, but woven into it. A person might sit near a doorway where the inside and outside met in a quiet balance. From there, they could feel the slight movement of the breeze, hear the distant sounds of the road, and remain close to the calm warmth of home. Their hands might be still for a moment, resting, or lightly holding something simple, like a piece of cloth or a small tool. Their thoughts would not rush. They would move slowly, like the drifting clouds above, sometimes settling on a memory of a letter, a certain phrase, a certain way a sentence had been written, words that had stayed behind even after the paper had been folded and put away. Letters had a way of doing that. They did not leave completely once they were read. They remained, softly, in the mind. In another place, perhaps in a town a few days' journey away, someone else might be in the act of writing again. The room would be quiet, light entering through a small window, resting gently on the surface of a wooden table, the paper laid out carefully, as always. There was a familiarity to the process, but never a sense of repetition. Each letter was its own moment. Each carried its own feeling. The pen would touch the paper slowly, ink flowing in a steady, careful line. There might be a pause after the first few words, a moment to consider what should come next, not because it was difficult, but because the writer understood the distance the letter would travel. Every word mattered, not in a heavy way, but in a quiet, lasting one. Sometimes the writer would smile slightly, remembering something simple, a shared memory, a small event, something that might seem ordinary, yet held meaning because it was being sent across that distance. And so the letter would grow, line by line, not long, not rushed, just enough to carry presence, just enough to say again, I am here. When it was finished, the folding of the paper felt like the closing of a quiet moment. The seal, whether wax or simple pressure, marked the end of that stillness. And then, once more, the letter would leave, stepping gently into the slow-moving world beyond the room. Back along the roads, the movement continued. Riders passed through familiar paths, their journeys repeated, yet never identical. The weather might shift from one day to the next, a cool wind one morning, a warm stillness the next, clouds gathering, then slowly drifting apart. The land responded quietly to these changes. Fields moved slightly under the wind, trees whispered in soft, steady motions, and through it all, letters traveled, carried in small numbers, handled with care. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand attention. They simply moved forward, always in motion, always on their way. In homes where letters were expected, there was often a certain place where they were kept, a drawer, perhaps, or a small box, something simple, something close. These places held more than paper. They held time, moments preserved in ink, voices captured in lines and curves. A person might open such a place in the quiet of the afternoon, not searching for anything new, just returning to what was already there. They might take out a letter and hold it for a moment before opening it, feeling its texture, remembering the moment it had first arrived. Then, slowly, they would unfold it again, the same words, the same gentle presence. Yet each reading felt slightly different because the person reading had changed,
even if only a little. Days had passed, thoughts had shifted, and so the letter met them in a new way each time. Outside, the road remained steady. It did not change for anyone. It did not hurry or slow. It simply existed, stretching forward, carrying whatever passed along it, sometimes empty, sometimes holding the quiet movement of a rider, sometimes bringing a letter closer to its destination. Evening would come again, as it always did, the light fading slowly, the air cooling, the world softening into a quieter version of itself. In these hours, the sense of waiting often became more gentle, less noticeable. The day had already given what it would give. There was no expectation left, only calm, only rest. And somewhere, beyond sight, beyond knowing, the steady journey of letters continued, never stopping, never rushing, always moving, one quiet step at a time. There were times when the waiting stretched longer than usual, not in a way that caused worry, but in a way that made the passage of time feel more noticeable. Days would pass, then more days, and still no letter would arrive. Yet even then, the feeling was not sharp. It was soft, a quiet awareness that something had not yet come. In these longer stretches, people often turned more deeply toward their surroundings. They noticed the small changes more clearly, the way the light shifted slightly earlier in the evening, the way the air carried a different scent after rain, the way the ground felt beneath their feet as the seasons slowly turned. These details filled the space. They gave shape to the waiting. A person might walk a familiar path, one they had taken many times before, each step known, each turn expected, and yet on this day, something might feel slightly different, not because the path had changed, but because the person walking it carried a quiet sense of time passing. The thought of a letter, still not arrived, might drift in and out of their mind, never staying too long, never pressing too hard, just present, like a distant sound that could be heard if one listened closely. In homes, conversations sometimes touched lightly on letters, not in long discussions, just brief mentions, a simple wondering, a quiet acknowledgement. Then the conversation would move on. There was no need to linger. Everyone understood the nature of waiting. It did not require explanation. Children, watching and listening, learned this understanding without being taught. They saw how adults lived with time, how they allowed things to arrive in their own moment, how they did not pull at what could not be hurried. And so they too grew familiar with this gentle patience. Far away, letters continued to move. Some were delayed by weather. A sudden rain could slow a journey. A swollen river might require a longer path. A road softened by days of moisture could make travel slower and more careful. But even then, the movement did not stop. It adjusted. It found its way. Letters, once sent, always moved forward, even if the pace changed, even if the path shifted slightly. In the quiet spaces of the day, people sometimes imagined the journey, not in detail, but in feeling. They might picture the letter traveling through open land, carried beneath wide skies, passing through places they had never seen. And in that imagining, there was a quiet connection, a sense that the letter was not lost, not forgotten, simply on its way. When a letter finally arrived after such a stretch, the moment carried a slightly deeper stillness, not excitement, not sudden change, but a quiet recognition. The waiting had come to rest again. The letter, once distant, now close, held in the hands, familiar, yet new. The opening of it was slow, careful, the unfolding of paper, the revealing of words, all done with a certain calm attention, because after waiting longer, the words seemed to carry a slightly different weight, not heavier, just more settled, more deeply felt. and as the letter was read, the time between its writing and its arrival seemed to fold gently into the present moment, bringing with it the quiet presence of someone far away. Evening would come, as always, the light softening, the air cooling, the world settling into rest. And once again, the rhythm would begin again, the reading, the remembering, the quiet placing of the letter in its place. And somewhere, without any sound or signal, the waiting would begin again, soft, patient, and steady, like the slow turning of the days themselves.
There were long afternoons when time seemed to stretch in a particularly gentle way, as if the day itself had decided to slow its pace even further. The sun would rest high in the sky, not harsh, not pressing, but steady and warm. Its light would fall softly across open fields, over wooden fences, along the quiet lines of the road that curved through the land without urgency. In these hours, movement became softer. People worked, but not quickly. Their hands moved in familiar patterns, shaped by repetition and quiet understanding. A task begun in the morning would continue, slowly and without interruption, carried forward by steady attention rather than any sense of haste. And in the background of it all, the thought of letters remained, not strong, not demanding, just present, a quiet thread woven through the stillness of the day. A woman might sit near a window, where the light rested gently across her hands. She might be sewing, her fingers guiding the needle through fabric with small, precise movements. The thread would pass through cloth again and again, each motion nearly identical to the last. There was a rhythm to it, a calm, repeating pattern that allowed the mind to drift. And as her hands continued their quiet work, her thoughts might move softly toward someone far away, not with longing that pressed or pulled, but with a calm awareness, a memory of a letter, the way certain words had been written, the shape of the handwriting, the small details that had been shared. She might pause for a moment, not stopping her work entirely, but slowing just enough to let the thought settle. Then, gently, she would continue. Outside, the road remained unchanged. It did not reveal what was coming. It did not offer signs or signals. It simply existed, holding its quiet path between places. Sometimes a faint sound would appear in the distance, the slow rhythm of hooves, soft at first, almost blending with the natural sounds of the day, then gradually becoming clearer, not loud, not sudden, just a steady presence moving closer. A person might notice. They might lift their head slightly, listen for a moment, then look toward the road. But there was no rush to stand, no need to move quickly. If it was the post, it would arrive in its own time. If it was not, the moment would pass just as gently. This was the nature of waiting. It did not require constant attention. It did not demand watchfulness. It simply existed alongside everything else. When the rider did arrive, the scene unfolded in the same quiet way it always had. The horse slowing, the dust settling softly beneath its steps, the rider moving with calm familiarity, a small exchange, a name spoken quietly, a letter, perhaps, handed over, or perhaps not. Both outcomes were part of the same rhythm. If there was a letter, it would be received with steady hands, not trembling, not hurried, just careful, because the moment itself was not something to rush through. It was something to move through slowly, to feel gently. The letter, once held, carried a certain stillness. It was light, yet it held something unseen, a connection, a presence, a voice that had traveled across time and distance. Some people would open it right there, standing near the door or along the road. Others would wait. They would bring it inside, place it on a table,
sit down before opening it, not out of hesitation, but out of quiet intention. They allowed the moment to settle before stepping into it. The breaking of the seal was soft, the unfolding of paper slower still, and then the words, always calm, always steady. Even when they carried emotion, it was not overwhelming. It moved gently, like everything else in that time. Each line read with care, each sentence allowed to rest for a moment before moving to the next. And when the letter was finished, it did not end abruptly. It lingered. The feeling remained. The presence stayed, even after the final word. The letter would be folded again carefully, as it had been before, and placed somewhere safe, not hidden, just kept, held close in a quiet way. The afternoon would continue, the light shifting slightly, becoming softer, the day moving forward as it always did. But something within it had changed just a little. The waiting, which had been there quietly, had now settled, at least for a time. And somewhere far away, another letter had already begun its journey.
As the seasons turned, the feeling of waiting for letters took on gentle changes of its own. In the cooler months, when the air carried a faint sharpness and the mornings arrived with a thin layer of frost, everything seemed to move a little more slowly. The ground felt firmer beneath each step. Breath could sometimes be seen in the early hours, rising softly into the still air. Inside homes, warmth became something carefully kept. Fires were tended with quiet attention. The soft crackling of wood became a steady companion to the day. And in this setting, letters held a slightly deeper kind of comfort. A person might sit closer to the fire in the evening, a letter resting in their hands. The glow of the flames would cast a gentle light across the page, making the ink appear softer, almost as if it carried warmth of its own. Reading in these moments felt especially calm. The outside world, colder and quieter, seemed farther away. The room itself became a small, contained space of stillness. And within that stillness, the words of the letter felt close, almost present, almost spoken. In contrast, during the warmer months, the waiting felt lighter. The days were longer. The light stretched further into the evening. The air carried the gentle sounds of movement, leaves shifting, insects humming softly, distant voices carried across open space. People spent more time outdoors. Work often took them into the fields or along paths that led away from home. And even then, the thought of letters remained. It moved with them, not tied to a place, but to a feeling. A person might pause in the middle of a task, standing beneath the open sky. They might look out across the land, where the horizon met the distance in a soft, steady line. And for a moment, they might think of the path a letter would take, through spaces like this, across open ground, under the same sky. The connection felt quiet, but real. In small towns, the arrival of the post was often a shared moment, though still a gentle one. A few people might be nearby when the rider arrived, standing at a distance, not gathering closely, not speaking loudly, just present, each waiting for their own possibility. The exchange of letters happened one by one, names spoken softly, hands reaching out, paper changing possession. There was no need for conversation beyond that. The moment itself carried enough meaning. Some would leave with a letter in hand, others would return home as they came, both with the same calm, because waiting did not end. It simply shifted, from waiting to receive to waiting again. In the quiet spaces of the night, letters sometimes took on an even deeper presence. A person lying in bed, the room dark and still, might think of the words they had read earlier.
Without the distractions of the day, those words seemed clearer, more settled. They would return slowly, line by line in memory, not all at once, just gently, like a soft echo. And sometimes those thoughts would blend with dreams, the voice within the letter becoming part of a quiet, drifting imagination. The distance between places, between people, softened even further in these moments, as if the letter had carried something beyond words, something that could remain even in silence. Outside, under the wide and quiet sky, the roads lay still, but the movement of letters did not stop. Somewhere a rider continued forward, or a letter rested briefly, waiting for the next part of its journey. Always moving, always on its way, and always, somewhere ahead, someone waited, not urgently, not anxiously, but patiently, gently, as part of the natural rhythm of life.
There were also moments when letters carried news that changed the quiet rhythm, though even then, the change came softly. A letter might arrive with words that spoke of something new, a journey taken, a place reached, a life shifting in some small or meaningful way. The reader would sit with these words carefully, not reacting quickly, not moving suddenly, but allowing the meaning to settle, slowly and fully. They might read the same part more than once, not because it was unclear, but because it needed time to be felt. Letters did not rush their meaning, they unfolded it gently. And so even news that carried change did not disturb the calm. It simply became part of it, a new thread in the quiet fabric of life. In the days that followed, those words might return often, while working, while resting, while walking along familiar paths. The letter remained present, not just as paper, but as thought, as feeling, as connection. And eventually, a reply would begin to form, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, a sentence here, a thought there, gathering quietly over time, until one day the person would sit down again, paper placed before them, pen in hand, and the process would begin once more. The slow, careful placing of words, the steady movement of ink, the quiet shaping of a voice meant to travel far. And when that letter was finished, folded, and sent on its way, the rhythm continued, unbroken, unchanged, a cycle of waiting, receiving, remembering, and sending again, all moving at the same gentle pace, all part of a life that did not rush, that did not press forward too quickly, but allowed each moment to arrive fully and pass just as softly. The road stretched on, the seasons turned, the days moved quietly from one to the next, and through it all, letters continued their slow and steady journeys, carrying voices, carrying presence, carrying the simple, enduring connection between people separated by distance, yet joined by something calm and lasting. And always, somewhere, someone waited, not with urgency, not with impatience, but with a quiet, steady heart.
There were mornings when a thin rain would fall, soft and steady, as if the sky itself had chosen to move more slowly. The drops would land gently on rooftops, on the packed earth of the road, on the leaves that lined the quiet edges of fields and trees. The sound was not loud. It was a soft, repeating pattern, almost like a distant whisper that continued without interruption. On such mornings, everything felt more contained. The world seemed to draw inward. People remained inside a little longer, moving through their routines with an even deeper calm. The fire would be tended carefully. The small spaces of home would feel warmer against the cool dampness outside. And the waiting for letters, on days like these, felt especially quiet. not because it had less meaning, but because the world itself had softened around it. A person might sit near a window, watching the rain trace slow paths down the glass. The road beyond would appear darker, its surface slightly blurred by the falling drops. No rider would come quickly in such weather. This was understood without needing to be said, and so the thought of letters rested gently, without expectation. The day would unfold in a slower rhythm. Tasks would still be done, but with pauses that stretched a little longer. Movements would be more deliberate, as if the rain had quietly encouraged everything to ease into a softer pace. Time did not feel lost in these moments. It simply felt extended, a longer space in which to exist, to think, to be still. And somewhere, far beyond the rain, letters continued their journeys, perhaps delayed slightly, perhaps resting for a short time in a small shelter or post station, but never forgotten, never abandoned, just moving in harmony with the world around them. By the time the rain faded, often in the late afternoon, the air would carry a different feeling, cooler, clearer. The ground would hold the memory of the rain and its scent, a soft, earthy presence rising gently into the air. The road would begin to dry slowly, and with that, movement would return. A rider might appear again, not hurried, not delayed beyond what was natural, simply continuing forward. And if a letter arrived on such a day, it carried with it the quiet sense of having traveled through something, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, patient one. The paper might feel slightly different in the hand, the edges perhaps a bit softened by the air, but the words inside remained unchanged, calm, steady, waiting to be read. And as the letter was opened, the sound of the rain, still faintly remembered, seemed to blend with the quiet unfolding of the page, creating a moment that felt whole, complete in its stillness.
There were also days filled with wind, though even the wind in those times rarely felt harsh. It moved steadily across the land, bending tall grasses in slow waves, brushing gently through the branches of trees, carrying with it the faint sounds of distant places. The road, on such days, seemed more alive. Dust might lift slightly in soft swirls. Loose leaves would drift along its surface, moving without direction, guided only by the quiet force of the air. For those waiting for letters, the wind brought a subtle sense of movement, not visible in the letters themselves, but felt in the world around them, a reminder that things were always in motion, always shifting, even when unseen. A person might stand outside for a moment, letting the wind pass around them, clothing moving gently, hair lifted slightly, the air cool or warm depending on the season. Their gaze might follow the road again, not searching, but simply observing. The horizon remained distant, unchanged, but the feeling of movement was there. And within that feeling, the quiet thought returned. A letter is on its way. Not with certainty, not with exact knowledge, but with a calm sense of possibility. Inside homes, the wind could be heard in softer ways, a faint sound along the edges of doors, a gentle stirring at the corners of windows. The movement was never loud enough to disturb, only enough to remind. Life existed both inside and outside, moving together in a steady balance. Letters carried through such conditions moved with the same quiet resilience. They did not resist the wind. They did not struggle against it. They simply continued, guided by the steady hands that carried them. Riders leaned slightly forward as they traveled, adjusting to the movement of the air. Their pace remained even, their path unchanged, and the letters they carried remained secure, protected within their small, worn bags.
each one holding its own quiet message, each one moving steadily toward its destination. When a letter finally reached its home after such days, there was no sign of the wind within it. The words remained still, unmoved by the journey. Yet somehow the journey felt present all the same, as if the distance, the movement, the passage through changing air and land had settled gently into the space between the lines. The reader might not think of it directly, but they would feel it, in the quiet depth of the moment, in the way the letter seemed to carry more than just words, more than just ink on paper, something subtle, something calm, something that had traveled far, slowly and with care.
Over time, the act of waiting became something deeply familiar. So familiar that it no longer felt like waiting at all. It simply felt like part of life, like the rising of the sun, like the turning of the seasons, like the quiet passage of one day into the next. People did not measure their days by the arrival of letters, yet letters gently marked the passage of time in their own way. A letter received became a moment remembered, a point in the quiet flow of life where something had arrived from beyond. And between those moments, life continued, steady, calm, unbroken. A person might go many days without thinking directly about letters, their mind occupied with the tasks before them, the needs of the day, the simple, necessary movements of living. And then, without warning, the thought would return, softly, naturally, as if it had never truly left. Perhaps triggered by a small detail, the sight of the road in a certain light, the sound of distant hooves, the memory of a phrase once read. And in that moment, the awareness would settle again. A letter exists somewhere, moving slowly, making its way through the world. This understanding did not create restlessness, it created calm, because it placed the letter within the same rhythm as everything else, slow, steady, certain in its movement, even if uncertain in its arrival. When letters were written, they were often written with this same understanding. Writers did not expect immediate replies. They did not measure time by quick exchanges. Instead, they allowed their words to carry forward without urgency, trusting the journey, trusting the time it would take, and trusting that eventually those words would be received. This trust was quiet, unspoken, but deeply present. It allowed people to remain at ease within the distance, to feel connected even when separated by many miles, to understand that connection did not require speed, only presence, only care, only time. And so the cycle continued, letters written, letters sent, letters traveling slowly across the land, letters received, read, and kept, and always between each of these moments the gentle, steady rhythm of waiting, never heavy, never sharp, just present, like a soft breath moving in and out, like the quiet turning of the world itself. There were long stretches of time when life seemed to settle into such a steady rhythm that the passing of days became almost indistinguishable from one another. Morning followed morning with the same gentle unfolding of light, and evening returned each day with the same soft fading into quiet darkness. In these stretches, the act of waiting for letters became less like a separate feeling and more like a quiet thread woven deeply into the fabric of existence. It did not rise to the surface often, and yet it was always there, resting gently beneath everything else. A person might wake early, before the full light of day had arrived, and sit for a moment in the stillness. The room would be dim, shaped by soft shadows and the faint outlines of familiar objects. Outside, the world would still be calm, untouched by the movement that would come later. In that stillness, thoughts came slowly, not in a rush, not in a crowd, but one at a time, like leaves drifting down onto quiet water.
And sometimes, among those thoughts, there would be a quiet awareness of distance. Not a heavy feeling, not one filled with longing, but simply an understanding that somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the fields and roads and towns, there were people living their own quiet mornings. And between those places, between those lives, letters moved slowly, carrying pieces of thought, pieces of presence from one to another. The day would begin gently. Small sounds would return first, the soft movement of fabric, the quiet placing of objects, the low and steady sounds of daily tasks beginning once more. There was no sudden start, no sharp beginning. Everything unfolded in its own time, just as it always had. As the hours passed, the memory of letters would sometimes surface again, not because anything had changed, but because the mind naturally returned to what was held quietly within it. A person might pause in their work for just a moment, their hands resting, their gaze drifting towards something distant or unseen. It was not a pause filled with expectation. It was simply a moment of stillness, where thought and time met briefly before continuing on. In those moments, the idea of a letter did not feel far away, even if it was. It felt present in a soft, unspoken way, as if the connection it carried did not depend entirely on its arrival, but existed already, quietly, in the space between people. When afternoon came, it often brought with it a deeper calm. The light would settle across the land in a steady, even way. Shadows would soften, sounds would grow more distant, and within this calm, the awareness of waiting would become even more gentle, almost blending completely into the background of the day. If a rider appeared on the road during such an afternoon, it would be noticed slowly. There would be no sudden movement, no rush toward the door or the path, only a quiet recognition, a steady watching as the figure moved closer, becoming clearer with each passing moment. And whether that rider carried a letter or not, the feeling remained the same, because waiting, by then, had become something deeper than expectation. It had become part of the way time was lived.
As days turned into weeks and weeks into longer stretches of time, people grew accustomed to the gentle uncertainty that surrounded letters. There was no fixed moment when one could be expected, no clear pattern that could be followed. And yet, this uncertainty did not bring unease. Instead, it allowed space for patience, for quiet thought, for the slow unfolding of life without interruption. In the evenings, when the day's work had been set aside and the light had begun to fade, there was often a deeper kind of reflection. The world outside would grow still again, much like it had been in the early morning, but now it carried the softness of a day completed. The air would feel cooler, and the sounds of life would quiet into something almost like silence. It was in these hours that letters were often felt most strongly. Not because they arrived more frequently, but because the mind, free from the steady movement of the day, had more room to wander. A person might sit quietly, hands resting in their lap, or perhaps holding something small and familiar. Their thoughts would move slowly, touching on moments from the day, then drifting further, reaching gently toward memories of words once read. A letter received days before might come back to mind in pieces. A single sentence, a simple phrase, the way a certain word had been written. These small details carried a quiet weight, not heavy but lasting, and in remembering them, the presence of the person who had written them seemed to return, not fully, not completely, but enough to be felt in a soft and steady way. Sometimes a person might take out the letter again, even if they had read it many times before. The act of unfolding it, of smoothing the paper gently, became a kind of quiet ritual. There was no urgency in it, no need to reach the end quickly. Each line would be read slowly, as if the words themselves required time to be fully heard.
And as the letter was read again, the distance it had traveled seemed to disappear, even if only for a moment. The room remained still. The night deepened outside, and within that quiet space, the connection carried by the letter felt close, almost as if it existed within the same moment, rather than across many days and miles. When the letter was folded again and set aside, the feeling did not vanish. It lingered softly, like the last warmth of the day before night fully settled. And as sleep came, slowly and gently, the presence of those words remained, resting quietly within the mind. There were also times when the act of waiting extended beyond the individual and became something shared, though still in a quiet and unspoken way. In small communities where lives moved alongside one another in steady familiarity, people often knew that others, too, were waiting. Not for the same letters, not for the same voices, but for something similar. A connection, a message, a presence carried across distance. This shared understanding did not lead to conversation in any loud or open sense. It was not often discussed directly. Instead, it existed beneath the surface, visible only in small gestures and quiet moments. A person might pass another on the road and exchange a brief glance. There would be no words about letters, no questions asked, and yet there might be a subtle awareness, a quiet recognition that both carried the same gentle rhythm within them. Waiting, living, continuing. In small gathering places, where a few people might come together for simple reasons, the presence of letters could sometimes be felt more clearly, not in what was said, but in what was not said. A pause in conversation, a moment when someone looked toward the door as it opened, the brief stillness when a rider passed outside. These were not dramatic moments. They were soft, almost invisible, but they carried meaning for those who noticed. And when letters did arrive in such places, the moment remained quiet, even if it was shared. A name spoken, a letter handed over, a small nod of acknowledgement. Then life continued. No lingering attention, no gathering around, just a quiet return to the steady rhythm of the day. This way of living allowed waiting to exist without weight. It did not press upon the mind or interrupt the flow of life. Instead, it moved alongside everything else, as natural and as steady as the passing of time itself. And in this shared stillness, in this quiet understanding between people, there was a kind of calm that needed no explanation, because everyone, in their own way, was part of the same slow, gentle movement, the same quiet exchange, the same enduring connection, carried again and again by letters traveling patiently across the land. There were certain evenings when the sky seemed to stretch endlessly, painted in soft, fading colors that moved so slowly they were almost impossible to notice. The light would linger just a little longer than expected, resting gently on rooftops, across fields, along the quiet edges of the road. In those moments, the world felt wide and calm at the same time, as if there were no urgency anywhere within it. People often stepped outside during these hours, not for any particular reason, but simply to be present in the quiet change of the day. A person might stand near the doorway of their home, or walk a few steps along the familiar path that led toward the road. Their movements would be slow, unhurried, guided only by a quiet awareness of the moment. The road itself, stretching into the distance, held a kind of quiet mystery. It did not reveal where it led beyond what could be seen. It curved gently, disappearing behind trees or small rises in the land. And yet, it was along this road that letters traveled, carrying words and thoughts from places unseen. Standing there, a person might not expect to see anything. They might simply look, allowing their gaze to rest on the horizon without searching. And yet, within that stillness, the thought of a letter could return once more, not as a question, but as a quiet presence. It was a feeling that did not need to be named, a soft awareness that somewhere, beyond that distant curve, something was moving closer, even if it could not yet be seen. As darkness slowly began to settle, the outlines of the land would soften. The road would grow dim, blending gently into the surrounding space. The sky would deepen into shades of blue and gray, and eventually into the quiet stillness of night. And with that, the sense of waiting would also soften. There was no expectation left in the evening, no thought of arrival before morning, only a calm acceptance that whatever was on its way would continue its journey through the night, unseen but steady. Inside, the world grew smaller, more contained. The soft glow of a lamp or fire would create a circle of warmth, holding the quiet space of the home together. Sounds were few and gentle, the turning of a page, the faint movement of fabric, the quiet shifting of someone settling into rest. And in that small circle of light, the presence of letters often felt closest. Not because they were physically there, but because the mind, free from the distractions of the day, could return to them more fully. A person might sit quietly, their thoughts drifting slowly. They might remember the feel of a letter in their hands, the slight texture of the paper, the shape of the words written across it. And in that remembering, the distance between past and present seemed to fade. The letter, though no longer being read, was still there, still present, still part of the moment. As sleep approached, slowly and without effort, those thoughts would soften further, blending gently into dreams, carrying with them the quiet presence of connection, of distance bridged not by speed, but by time and care.
There were also mornings when the air carried a faint warmth even before the sun had fully risen, suggesting the quiet arrival of a new season. The ground would feel different beneath one's feet, softer perhaps, or carrying a subtle change in scent. These small shifts in the world were noticed not all at once, but gradually over many days. And as the seasons changed, so too did the feeling of waiting for letters. It did not transform completely, it did not become something new, but it adjusted gently, like everything else. In warmer weather, the days stretched longer, offering more time for movement, for work, for quiet activity beneath the open sky. People spent hours outdoors, their attention often focused on the tasks before them, the land around them, the steady rhythm of their own labor. And yet, even in these extended days, the awareness of letters remained. It might appear in a brief pause when someone straightened their back and looked across the fields. It might come in the form of a thought that passed quietly through the mind, as natural and unforced as a breath. A letter is somewhere, traveling, moving forward. This understanding did not interrupt the day. It did not demand action. It simply existed alongside everything else. In these seasons, the arrival of a letter often felt like a gentle addition to an already full day. It did not stand apart from the rhythm of life. It became part of it, blending seamlessly into the ongoing flow of time. A rider might arrive while work was still being done. There would be no sudden stopping, no sharp change, only a gradual shift, a moment of attention, a quiet exchange. Then, just as gently, the return to what had been happening before. The letter itself would wait patiently to be read, perhaps set aside for a short while until there was a moment of stillness. Because reading a letter was not something to be done in haste. It was something to be entered into slowly, with care.
And so, even when it had arrived, the letter became part of the rhythm of waiting once more, waiting to be opened, waiting to be read, waiting to be felt. In this way, the cycle continued without interruption, each part flowing into the next, each moment connected by the same steady, unhurried pace.
There were times when the distance between letters seemed to grow longer, not because anything had changed in the world, but because time itself moved in a way that felt wider, more open. Days passed quietly, then more days, and still no new letter would arrive. And yet this absence did not feel empty. It felt spacious, like a long stretch of road with no travelers in sight, but still full of possibility. During these times, people often turned inward more deeply, not in a heavy or reflective way, but in a calm, natural one. Their attention settled on the present moment, on the tasks of the day, on the small details that made up their lives. The absence of a letter did not take something away, it simply left more room for what was already there. A person might spend an afternoon in quiet work, their movements steady, their thoughts light and unburdened. The world around them would continue as it always had, offering its quiet patterns and gentle rhythms. And within that steady flow, the idea of a letter would sometimes return, not as something missing, but as something that existed just beyond the present moment. Not here yet, but not far away. When a letter finally arrived after such a stretch, the moment carried a certain depth, not excitement, not surprise, but a quiet fullness, as if something that had been slowly approaching had finally come to rest. The letter would be held carefully, opened slowly, read with the same calm attention as always. And yet, beneath that calm, there was a subtle sense of time having gathered within it. Days, perhaps weeks, all resting quietly between the lines. The reader did not rush through those lines. They allowed each one to settle, to be understood, to be felt. Because the letter was not just a message, it was a moment that had traveled across time and distance to arrive exactly where it was meant to be. And when it was finished, when the paper was folded once more and placed aside, the quiet rhythm began again. Waiting returned, not as something new, but as something familiar, something steady, something that had always been there and would continue to be. Like the slow turning of the seasons, like the quiet passage of the days, like the road stretching endlessly forward, carrying with it the soft, unseen movement of letters on their way. There were quiet mornings when a thin layer of fog rested gently over the land, softening every edge and muting every color. The road, usually clear and steady in its path, would fade into a pale distance as if it had no clear beginning or end. Trees stood like faint shapes, their outlines blurred, their details hidden within the stillness. On such mornings, the world felt closer and farther at the same time. Closer because everything nearby seemed wrapped in a soft silence. Farther because beyond that silence nothing could be clearly seen. In this gentle obscurity, the idea of letters took on a slightly different feeling. They were no longer imagined as something visible in the distance, moving steadily along a clear road. Instead, they became something more unseen, something moving quietly through space that could not be fully observed. A person might step outside and stand for a moment, their breath blending softly into the cool air. The ground beneath them would feel damp, holding the quiet presence of the fog. Sounds would be softer, as if absorbed by the air itself. Even the faintest noise, a distant step, a shifting branch, would seem far away. And within that quiet, the awareness of waiting would feel even more subtle. Not a thought that came and went,
but something that simply existed, like the fog itself, present, steady, and calm. The road, though hidden, was still there, its path unchanged, its purpose the same. And somewhere along that path, beyond what could be seen, letters continued their slow and steady movement. This understanding did not need to be proven. It did not rely on sight. It was simply known. As the morning moved forward, the fog would begin to lift slowly, not all at once, but in soft, gradual shifts. Shapes would return. The road would become clearer. The distance would reveal itself once more. And with that clarity, the sense of the world would widen again. A rider might appear in that distance, at first only a faint outline, then slowly more defined, the movement steady, unchanged by the earlier stillness. If a letter arrived on such a morning, it carried with it a quiet sense of having come from beyond that unseen space, from a place that had existed even when it could not be observed. And as the letter was opened, its words seemed to emerge from that same quiet distance, not rushed, not sudden, but gently revealed, line by line, as if they had always been there, waiting to be seen.
There were also long evenings when the sky remained clear and open, filled with a quiet expanse of stars that stretched endlessly above. The air would be still, carrying a cool softness that settled gently over the land. On such nights, the world felt both vast and calm. The road lay silent, its surface pale under the faint light of the sky. No movement disturbed it, no sound carried along it. It rested, as if pausing along with everything else. Inside homes, the quiet deepened. The day had fully ended. The tasks were done. The movements of life had slowed to their softest point. In these hours, thoughts often wandered further than they did during the day. There was space for them to move without direction, without purpose, simply drifting. And sometimes they drifted toward the idea of distance, of places far away, of lives unfolding beyond what could be seen or known. And within those thoughts, letters appeared again, not as objects, not as paper or ink, but as connections, as quiet bridges between one place and another. A person might sit in silence, looking out through a window at the wide open sky. Their gaze would not focus on any one star, but on the space between them. That space, vast and still, seemed to hold something unspoken, a reminder that distance did not erase connection, that even across wide and quiet expanses, something could travel slowly, patiently, and arrive in its own time. Letters, in their steady movement, carried that same understanding. They did not cross the sky. They did not move quickly, but they connected places in a way that felt just as certain. A letter written under one sky could be read under another, and yet the feeling within it remained the same, calm, steady, present. When sleep came on such nights, it often came gently, without interruption, without restlessness. And in that quiet descent into rest, the presence of letters remained, not as a thought to hold on to, but as something already understood, something already part of the quiet rhythm of life. Over longer stretches of time, the act of waiting shaped not only how people lived their days, but how they understood time itself. Time was not something measured in quick moments or immediate responses. It was something that unfolded slowly, in layers. A letter written was not meant to be answered quickly. It was meant to travel, to arrive, to be read, to be held, to be thought about, and only then, perhaps, to be answered. This created a rhythm that was both simple and deeply steady. There was space between each step,
space that was not empty, but full of life. A person might spend many days between receiving a letter and writing a reply, not because they were delaying, not because they were unsure, but because the act of responding was part of a larger flow. Thoughts needed time to settle. Feelings needed time to become clear. Words needed time to form. And in that time, life continued. The letter remained present even when it was not being read. Its words lingered quietly, shaping thoughts in small, gentle ways. When the reply was finally written, it carried within it not just a moment, but a stretch of time. Days of thought, days of living, all gathered into a few lines of ink. And once sent, the rhythm began again. The letter moved forward. The waiting returned. But it was never the same waiting as before, because each cycle added something new, a new layer of connection, a new thread in the quiet fabric of life. Over years, this pattern became deeply familiar, so familiar that it no longer felt like a process. It simply felt like the way things were, like breathing, like the turning of the seasons, like the steady passage of days into nights and nights into days again. And in this rhythm, people found a quiet kind of peace, a way of living that did not depend on speed or certainty, but on patience, on presence, on the gentle understanding that everything that needed to arrive would do so in its own time, carried slowly along the road, through changing weather, across quiet distances, until, at last, it came to rest in waiting hands. And then, just as gently, the journey would begin again.
There were early dawns when the light arrived so slowly that it was difficult to notice the exact moment when night became morning. The sky would begin in a deep, quiet gray, almost indistinguishable from darkness, and then, little by little, it would soften. A faint glow would appear along the horizon, spreading gently, touching the tops of trees, the edges of rooftops, the still surface of the road. In those moments, the world felt as though it were waking carefully, without hurry. A person rising at such an hour might move quietly, as if not to disturb the calm that rested over everything. Their footsteps would be soft, their movements slow and measured. Even the smallest sounds seemed to carry further in the quiet air. Standing near a window or just outside a doorway, they might look out at the road, now barely visible in the pale light. It stretched ahead as it always had, unchanged, steady and silent. And within that silence, the thought of letters existed in its most gentle form, not as an expectation, not even as a clear thought, but as a quiet understanding, as natural as the light slowly filling the sky. Somewhere, something was moving. A letter, perhaps, already written days before, resting in a small bundle with others, or being carried along a distant path. There was no need to know exactly where it was, no need to measure its progress. The knowledge of its movement was enough. As the morning grew, the sounds of life would return, a distant call, the soft opening of a door, the quiet stirring of activity beginning again. And with that, the deeper stillness of dawn would gently fade into the steady rhythm of the day. But something of it remained, a calm that carried forward, a softness that shaped the hours that followed. In that calm, waiting did not feel like waiting at all. It felt like simply being part of the day, part of the slow unfolding of time itself.
There were also times when the road itself seemed to carry more presence than usual, not because anything had changed in its form, but because of the way it was observed. A person might spend a longer moment watching it, their gaze following its path as far as it could go. They might notice the small details, the uneven surface, the slight bends, the places where grass grew along its edges. These details had always been there,
But in moments of quiet attention, they seemed to hold more meaning. Because the road was not just a path for travel, it was the thread that connected places, the line along which letters moved, slowly and steadily, bridging distances that could not be crossed in any other way. Watching the road, a person might imagine the many journeys that had taken place along it, not in clear pictures, not in specific events, but in a general, gentle sense. Riders passing through different seasons, letters carried through sun and rain, through stillness and wind. Each journey quiet, each one part of something larger. This awareness did not bring excitement, it brought calm, a feeling that the world was always in motion, even when it appeared still, that connections were always being made, even when they could not be seen. And in that understanding, the act of waiting felt less like waiting for something to begin, and more like being part of something already in progress. The road did not start when someone looked at it. It did not end when they turned away. It continued, steady and unchanged, carrying its quiet purpose forward. And so did the letters, always moving, always on their way. As time moved gently forward, there were moments when a person would sit with pen and paper before them, not yet writing, but simply resting in the quiet space before words began. These moments were not empty. They were full of thought, though not in a busy or crowded way. Thoughts came slowly, forming and settling like soft ripples on still water. A person might think of the letter they had received last, the words within it, the tone, the feeling, the small details that had been shared. They might recall a particular sentence, not because it was remarkable, but because it had stayed with them in a quiet way. And as they sat there, those memories would begin to shape new thoughts, new words, not written yet, but forming gently. There was no need to hurry this process. The letter they would write did not need to be completed quickly. It needed to be true. It needed to carry something real, something steady. And so they waited, even within the act of writing. They allowed the words to come when they were ready. When the pen finally touched the paper, it did so with calm intention, each line written slowly, each word placed with care. There were pauses, as there always were, moments when the pen lifted, when the writer looked away briefly, allowing the next thought to arrive. The room remained quiet during this time. The world outside continued its steady movement, and within that stillness, the letter took shape. Not rushed, not forced, just gently formed. When it was finished, it carried within it not just words, but time. The time spent thinking, the time spent remembering, the time spent allowing the message to become clear. And once it was folded and set aside, ready to begin its journey, the same quiet feeling returned. A sense of something moving forward, something continuing beyond the present moment. The cycle remained unbroken, writing, sending, waiting, receiving, each part flowing into the next without interruption, each part carried by the same steady, calming rhythm, like the slow movement of the day from morning to evening, like the quiet turning of the seasons, like the road itself stretching endlessly forward, holding within it the gentle, unseen passage of letters traveling from one life to another. There were afternoons when the sunlight seemed to rest gently on everything it touched, as if it had no intention of moving on too quickly. The warmth settled across the land in a quiet, even way, touching wooden fences, low rooftops, and the long, steady stretch of the road that wound through it all. In these hours, the world felt open and calm. A person might sit just outside their home, perhaps on a simple chair or step, where they could feel both the warmth of the sun and the soft movement of the air. Their hands might rest loosely in their lap or move slowly through a small, familiar task. Nothing required urgency, nothing called for haste. And within this stillness, the thought of letters would return in the most natural way. Not because anything had changed, not because anything was expected, but simply because the mind, at rest, often turned toward what was quietly important. A letter might be imagined as it traveled, not in clear detail, but as a soft presence moving somewhere beyond sight. It might be crossing a field like the one nearby, or passing along a road similar to the one before them. This imagining did not feel distant. It felt close, as if the space between here and there was not so wide after all. The connection carried by the letter seemed to shorten that distance, not by speed, but by meaning. Time in these moments felt wide and gentle. The afternoon did not press forward. It unfolded slowly, giving space for thought, for quiet awareness, for simply being. And within that presence, waiting felt complete, not lacking anything, not reaching for anything, just resting, quietly, alongside the steady movement of the day.
There were also moments when the sound of footsteps or hooves would rise softly in the distance, barely noticeable at first, like a faint echo carried across the land. These sounds did not interrupt the calm. They blended into it. A person might hear them without immediately recognizing what they were. Just a rhythm, slow, even, drawing slightly closer with each passing moment. Their attention might shift gently, not out of urgency, but out of quiet curiosity. They might lift their head, their gaze moving toward the road almost without thought. The figure, still distant, would appear small against the wide space of the landscape, moving steadily, unhurried. It was not always clear who it was or what they carried, and so there was no immediate change in movement, no sudden pause in the day, only a quiet noticing. If it was the post, that realization came slowly as the rider drew nearer. The familiar shape, the steady pace, the small details that had been seen many times before. Recognition, when it came, was gentle, and with it the awareness that perhaps on this day a letter had arrived. Still, there was no rush, no sudden movement toward the road. The moment was allowed to unfold in its own time. The rider would approach, the horse slowing naturally as it came closer. The quiet exchange would follow, just as it always had. A name spoken, a letter perhaps handed over, or perhaps none at all. Both outcomes were met with the same calm, because the rhythm did not depend on certainty. It existed within the possibility itself. If a letter was received, it would be held carefully, not examined immediately, not opened in haste, just held for a moment as if acknowledging the quiet journey it had taken. Then, slowly, the person might turn back toward their home, the letter resting in their hands, carrying with it something unseen, something that had traveled far without ever being hurried. There were times when letters, once received, were not read right away, but instead kept close for a while, as if allowing the moment of arrival to settle before stepping into the words within. A person might place the letter gently on a table, or hold it loosely while sitting in a quiet space. Their attention would remain soft, not focused entirely on the letter, but aware of its presence. This pause was not hesitation. It was part of the rhythm, an understanding that the experience of reading did not need to begin immediately, that it could wait, that the moment itself held value. In that waiting, the letter became something more than just a message. It became a presence, a quiet reminder of distance bridged, of time carried across space. Eventually, the moment to open it would come, not marked by any clear signal, just a natural shift, a feeling that now was the time.
The hands would move slowly. The seal, if there was one, would be broken with care. The paper unfolded gently, its soft sound blending into the stillness of the room. And then the words. They did not rush forward. They did not demand to be read quickly. They rested there, waiting, just as patiently as the letter itself had waited during its journey. Each line would be taken in slowly, the meaning allowed to settle, the voice within the words heard in a quiet, steady way. There was no need to reach the end quickly. The reading itself was the moment, a space of connection, a pause within the flow of the day where something distant became close. And when the final line was read, the letter did not simply end, it remained, its presence continuing in the quiet that followed. The paper would be folded again just as carefully as before, placed somewhere safe, somewhere it could be returned to. Because letters were rarely read only once, they became part of the days that followed, returning in thought, returning in memory, returning in quiet moments when the mind drifted gently back to them. And so, even after being read, the letter continued to exist within the steady rhythm of life, not as something finished, but as something ongoing, a soft and lasting connection carried forward in time.
There were long, quiet stretches of late afternoon when the light seemed to settle across the land in a way that made everything feel gently complete, even before the day had fully come to an end. The sun would hang lower in the sky, its brightness softened, its warmth spread evenly over fields, rooftops, and the slow curve of the road. Shadows would grow longer, stretching calmly across the ground, not in sharp lines, but in soft, fading shapes. In these hours, the world often felt as though it had reached a kind of balance. The work of the day was not yet finished, but it had begun to slow. Movements became more measured. Tasks that had filled the earlier hours now approached their natural end. There was no sense of urgency to complete them all at once. Instead, everything unfolded gradually, as if guided by an unspoken understanding that there was still time. A person might pause during such an afternoon, not because they were tired, but because the moment itself invited stillness. They might stand quietly, looking out over a familiar view, the stretch of land they had seen countless times, the same road, the same horizon, the same gentle rise and fall of the ground. And yet, even in its familiarity, there was something new in each glance. The light had changed. The air had shifted slightly. The day, though similar to many before it, was still its own. In that quiet pause, the thought of letters often returned in a deeper way, not as a passing awareness, but as something that settled more fully into the mind. The stillness of the afternoon seemed to make space for it. A letter somewhere was moving, not quickly, not directly known, but steadily. The mind might begin to trace its imagined path, not in clear detail, but in feeling. It might pass through places like this, under this same light, along roads just as quiet. It might rest for a time, held safely in a small place, before continuing again. These thoughts did not feel distant or uncertain. They felt calm, certain in their own quiet way, because even without seeing the letter, even without knowing exactly where it was, there was a deep understanding that it existed, that it was part of the same slow and steady world. As the light continued to soften, the feeling of waiting became even gentler, less like waiting for something to happen, more like being present within something already unfolding. The day itself became a kind of letter, moving slowly, revealing itself line by line, moment by moment. And within it, the quiet connection between distant places remained steady and unchanged.
There were evenings when the air carried a faint coolness that seemed to settle gently into every part of the landscape, signaling the gradual close of the day. The sky would begin to dim in soft layers, the brightness fading into a calm, muted glow that rested just above the horizon before giving way to the deeper tones of night. In these moments, everything seemed to quiet at once. The sounds of movement grew fewer, the distant activity of the day faded into silence. Even the wind, if it had been present, often softened into something barely noticeable. Inside homes, small lights would begin to glow, lamps, candles, or the steady warmth of a fire. These lights did not fill the room completely. They created pockets of softness, gentle spaces where the day could come to rest. It was during these hours that letters often felt closest to the heart. Not because they arrived more frequently, but because the stillness of the evening allowed them to be felt more deeply. A person might sit quietly, the letter they had received resting nearby, or perhaps already returned to its place. Their thoughts would move slowly, not directed toward anything in particular, and then, without effort, they would return to the words they had read. The voice within the letter would come back, not loudly, not fully formed, but in fragments. A phrase, a tone, a sense of presence. These fragments would drift gently through the mind, settling without disturbance. The distance between the writer and the reader would feel smaller in these moments, not because it had changed, but because the mind no longer measured it in miles or days. It simply felt the connection, and that was enough. Outside, the road would lie still, now only faintly visible in the dimming light. It held no sign of movement, no hint of what had passed along it or what would come. And yet, even in its stillness, it remained part of the quiet flow of things. Because somewhere beyond the visible distance, letters continued their journeys, moving through the night just as they had moved through the day, carried forward by the same steady rhythm. When sleep came, it often came softly, without interruption, without urgency, and within that quiet rest, the presence of letters did not disappear. It remained gently as part of the calm and steady world that existed even in dreams.
There were times when the memory of a letter lasted far longer than the moment of reading itself, extending quietly into many days that followed. The words, once read, did not remain fixed on the page alone. They moved into thought, into feeling, into the small and steady moments of daily life. A person might be walking along a familiar path, their steps slow and even, the ground beneath them known and unchanging. Their attention might rest on the present, the feel of the air, the gentle sounds around them, the quiet movement of the world. And then, without any clear beginning, a thought from a letter would return. Not the entire letter, not every word, just a single line, or even just the feeling of it. It would appear softly, as if it had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be noticed again. The person might pause slightly, not stopping their movement entirely, but allowing that thought to settle. It did not interrupt the moment. It became part of it, blending with the surroundings, with the quiet rhythm of the walk, with the steady passage of time. In this way, letters extended beyond their physical form. They became something carried within, something that could be returned to without opening the paper, something that existed in memory as clearly as it had on the page. This quiet presence changed the nature of waiting, because even in the absence of a new letter, there was still something there, still a connection, still a voice that could be heard softly in the mind. And so waiting was never empty. It was filled with what had already been received, with what had already been shared, with what continued to exist gently and steadily across time.
When a new letter eventually arrived, it did not replace the old ones. It joined them, adding to the quiet collection of moments, of thoughts, of connections that had been carried across distance, each letter becoming part of a larger whole, a slow and continuous exchange that unfolded over days, weeks, and years. And through it all, the rhythm remained unchanged, steady, calm, unbroken, like the road stretching forward without end, like the days passing one into the next, like the quiet and patient movement of letters, always on their way, always connecting one life to another.
There were mornings when the world felt especially still, as if it had not yet fully decided to begin the day. The light would come slowly, touching the edges of things without fully revealing them, and the air would carry a soft, quiet coolness that seemed to pause everything in place. In these early hours, before the sounds of movement returned, a person might sit in silence, not doing anything in particular, simply present within the calm. In such moments, time did not feel like something moving forward. It felt like something gently expanding, creating space rather than passing through it. And within that space, the awareness of letters rested in its most peaceful form. It was not a thought that came and went. It was something constant, like the light slowly growing in the sky. A person might look out toward the road, not expecting to see anything, not searching, but simply allowing their gaze to settle there. The road would appear quiet, unchanged, holding its place within the landscape without any sign of movement. And yet, even in that stillness, it carried meaning. It was the path along which words traveled, the quiet line that connected distant lives. This understanding did not need to be spoken. It existed naturally, as part of the way the world was known. As the morning unfolded, small sounds would return, one by one, gently filling the space that had been held by silence. A door opening, a soft step on the floor, the faint stirring of activity beginning again. These sounds did not break the calm, they became part of it. And through all of it, the slow rhythm of waiting remained steady. It did not press forward, it did not ask to be noticed, it simply continued, quietly present within the flow of the day.
There were long midday hours when the sun stood high and steady, and the world seemed to settle into a kind of quiet endurance. The light was even and constant, casting few shadows, leaving everything clearly visible and gently defined. In these hours, there was a sense of stillness that came not from silence, but from balance. Work continued as it always did, but without strain or urgency. Movements were steady, practiced, familiar. A person might spend time tending to simple tasks, their hands moving with a quiet confidence that came from repetition. There was no need to think about each motion. It was understood, carried out naturally. And within that steady rhythm, the mind was free to wander softly. Thoughts would come and go, not in a rush, but in a calm and measured way. Some would stay longer than others, some would pass almost unnoticed. And among them, the idea of a letter might appear again, as it often did. Not as something new, not as something pressing, but as something that had always been there. A quiet awareness that somewhere beyond the visible edges of the day, there were words moving closer. The person might not stop what they were doing, they might not even look up, but the thought would settle gently, becoming part of the moment. And then, just as softly, it would fade again, leaving behind a sense of calm rather than absence. Time in these hours did not feel slow or fast, it simply moved, steady, unbroken, like the quiet passage of letters along the road, unseen but always in motion.
There were also quiet returns at the end of the day, when a person came back to the familiar space of home after hours spent outside. The transition was always gentle. The world beyond the door did not disappear. It simply softened, becoming part of the background as the calm of the interior space took hold. The air inside would feel still and contained, carrying the faint warmth of the day's earlier hours. Light, if any remained, would fall softly across the room, touching simple objects, the edge of a table, the back of a chair, the surface of a wall. In this quiet return, there was often a sense of settling, not just physically, but within the mind. The thoughts of the day would slow. The steady movement of activity would come to rest. And within that stillness, the presence of letters would sometimes rise again, more clearly than before. A person might think of a letter they had received, or one they had written, or one that had not yet arrived. But these thoughts did not carry weight. They did not bring urgency. They simply existed, as part of the larger quiet. If a letter was nearby, it might be taken out once more, not because it needed to be read again, but because its presence offered something calm and familiar. The act of holding it, of unfolding it slowly, became a kind of quiet continuation of the day, a moment where time seemed to pause, even as it moved forward. And when the letter was set aside again, nothing felt lost. The connection remained, soft, steady, unchanged. Outside, the light would continue to fade. The road would grow dim. And somewhere, far beyond what could be seen, another letter would continue its journey, moving slowly, patiently, toward a place where it would one day be received, opened, and quietly understood.
There were long stretches of quiet days when nothing seemed to change in any noticeable way, and yet, beneath that stillness, everything continued to move forward with a gentle certainty. The mornings arrived softly, the afternoons settled into their calm patterns, and the evenings faded without interruption. These days did not stand apart from one another. They blended together, forming a continuous flow that felt steady and complete. In such times, waiting for letters became something almost invisible. It did not rise to the surface of thought often. It did not shape the day in any obvious way. And yet, it was always there, resting quietly beneath everything else. A person might go through the entire day without thinking directly about a letter, moving from one task to another, from one moment to the next, without pause. But then, in a brief, still moment, perhaps while standing near a doorway or resting their hands after finishing a simple task, the thought would return. Not strongly, not suddenly, just gently. A quiet awareness that somewhere, beyond the immediate world, something was moving. A letter, perhaps, written in another place, carried along a road not seen, passing through landscapes that existed only in imagination. This thought did not interrupt the calm. It became part of it, blending into the steady rhythm of the day just as naturally as the movement of light across the ground or the slow passing of time itself. And then, just as softly as it had come, it would fade again, leaving behind no emptiness, no sense of absence, only the quiet continuation of the day. There were also gentle afternoons when the sky held a pale, even light, and the air felt almost perfectly still. On such days, sound seemed to travel differently, carrying softly across distance without losing its shape. A faint noise from far away, a step, a voice, the slow movement of a cart, might reach the ear as clearly as something much closer. In these moments, the awareness of the road often became more present.
A person might pause and listen, not searching for anything in particular, but simply noticing the quiet details of the world around them. The road, though unseen in that moment, felt close, its presence known through the possibility of movement. And within that awareness, the thought of letters might rise again, not as a clear image, but as a soft connection between sound and distance. A faint rhythm in the air might suggest movement. A quiet pattern might hint at something approaching, but there was never certainty, and there did not need to be, because the rhythm of waiting was not built on knowing, it was built on allowing time to pass, allowing things to arrive when they would, allowing the day to unfold without interruption. If a rider did appear, it would happen slowly, the sound becoming clearer, the shape forming in the distance, the movement steady and unchanging. And when the moment of arrival came, it would carry the same quiet simplicity as always. No sudden change, no sharp shift, only a gentle continuation of what had been happening all along.
There were times when the act of writing a letter felt like a quiet conversation held across distance, even though no reply would come for many days. A person sitting at a table, pen in hand, might feel a calm sense of presence, as if the person they were writing to existed gently within the moment, not physically, but in thought. The room would be still. The light would rest softly across the surface of the paper, and the sound of the pen moving would be the only movement breaking the silence. Each word written would feel deliberate, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it carried weight in its simplicity. There was no need to explain everything, no need to fill every space. Even small details held meaning. A mention of the weather, a note about the day's work, a quiet memory shared in a single line. These things, though simple, traveled far. They carried with them a sense of presence that could not be replaced by anything else. The writer would pause often, not out of uncertainty, but out of thoughtfulness, looking away from the page for a moment, letting the next words come naturally. There was no pressure to finish quickly. The letter would take the time it needed, and when it was done, it would be folded with the same care it had been written with, held for a moment before being set aside, as if acknowledging that something had been completed, something that would now continue its journey beyond the quiet room. Once sent, the letter would leave behind a calm space. The act of writing, though finished, remained present in the mind. And in that space, waiting would begin again, not as something new, but as a continuation, a steady, familiar rhythm that moved alongside everything else, like the quiet turning of the day into evening, like the soft fading of light into darkness, like the endless path of the road carrying forward what had been placed upon it, one gentle step at a time.
There were slow, quiet mornings when a light breeze moved gently across the land, just enough to stir the leaves and brush softly against the surface of the road. The air carried a calm freshness, not cold, not warm, but balanced in a way that made everything feel steady and unhurried. In these moments, the world seemed to wake without effort, as if it had never truly been asleep, only resting in a softer state. A person stepping outside during such a morning might pause without thinking, simply to take in the quiet movement around them. The trees would shift slightly, their branches moving in a slow and steady rhythm. The ground beneath their feet would feel firm, familiar, unchanged from the day before. And in that quiet familiarity, the thought of letters would exist in a way that felt almost natural, like the movement of the breeze itself. Not something separate, not something to be focused on, but something that was simply there.
The idea that somewhere, at that very moment, a letter might be moving along another road, under another sky, carried forward with the same calm steadiness. This understanding did not create anticipation. It created a sense of connection that felt quiet and complete. The morning would continue, unfolding slowly as it always did. Tasks would begin. Movements would settle into their usual patterns. And within those patterns, the presence of waiting would remain, not as a pause, but as a gentle continuation. Time did not need to be measured. It moved on its own, steady, unbroken, like the unseen journey of letters, always progressing, always approaching, even when no one was watching.
There were long midday hours when the warmth of the sun seemed to press softly against everything, not in a heavy way, but in a way that encouraged stillness. The air would grow quiet, almost resting, as if even the wind had chosen to pause for a while. In these hours, the world often felt suspended, not frozen, but gently held in place. A person might sit in the shade, allowing the warmth to settle around them while remaining in the cooler edge of it. Their hands might be still or moving slowly through a simple, repetitive task. There was no need to hurry, no reason to move quickly. The day itself seemed to suggest patience. And within that patience, the thought of letters would drift softly through the mind, not as something distant, but as something already part of the moment. A letter traveling slowly would be passing through a day like this somewhere else. It might be carried along a road warmed by the same kind of sun. It might rest for a time in a quiet place, waiting for the next part of its journey. This imagining did not feel uncertain. It felt calm, because the world itself moved in the same way, slowly, steadily, without interruption. A person might close their eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but simply to rest within the stillness. And in that brief pause, the sense of time would soften even further. Minutes would pass without being counted. Thoughts would come and go without leaving any trace, and the quiet awareness of waiting would remain, unchanged, steady as ever. When the person opened their eyes again, nothing would feel different. The day would still be there, the warmth would still rest across the land, and somewhere, unseen, the slow journey of letters would continue.
There were evenings when the return of quiet felt deeper than usual, as if the entire day had gently folded itself into a single calm moment. The light would fade slowly, not disappearing all at once, but retreating in soft layers until only a faint glow remained. The road, once clearly visible, would become a darker line across the land, blending into the growing stillness. The shapes of trees and buildings would soften, their edges no longer sharp, their presence more felt than seen. Inside, the quiet of home would settle in naturally. A chair pulled close, a small light glowing softly, the familiar arrangement of simple objects resting in their places. It was in these moments that the presence of letters often felt the most settled, not active, not moving, but resting. A person might take out a letter they had received, not because they needed to read it again, but because it offered a quiet sense of connection that matched the calm of the evening. Holding it in their hands, they might feel its lightness, its stillness, its quiet weight. The words inside did not need to be spoken again to be understood. They had already become part of something deeper, part of memory, part of feeling, part of the quiet rhythm of life. And yet, sometimes, the letter would be opened again, slowly, carefully, each fold undone with the same gentle attention as before.
The words, though unchanged, would feel slightly different, not because they had altered, but because the moment of reading had changed. The evening carried its own stillness, its own softness, and within that space the letter seemed to belong in a new way. When it was folded once more and placed aside, the feeling remained, not fading, not ending, just continuing quietly. Outside, the night would deepen, the road would rest in darkness, and somewhere far away, beyond what could be seen or imagined clearly, another letter would continue its journey, moving forward, steady, unseen, carrying with it the same quiet presence that had been felt again and again in moments like this across many days and nights.
And so the quiet rhythm continued, just as it always had, without a clear beginning and without any need for an ending. The night, now fully settled, held the land in a deep and gentle stillness. The sky stretched wide above, calm and unmoving, while the earth below rested in soft darkness. The road, no longer visible in detail, remained where it had always been, stretching forward into the distance, carrying within it the memory of every step, every passing moment, every letter that had traveled along its quiet path. Inside, the light had grown dim. The small glow that once filled the room had softened into something even gentler, barely touching the edges of the space. Objects rested where they had been left, unchanged, familiar, part of the steady pattern of life that moved forward without interruption. A letter, perhaps, lay nearby, folded, still, at rest. It no longer needed to be opened again. Its words had already found their place, not only on the page, but within thought, within memory, within the quiet spaces that stretched between one moment and the next. And beyond that room, beyond that quiet home, beyond the stillness of the night, the slow movement of letters continued, unseen, unheard, yet steady as ever. A rider somewhere far along a darkened road might still be traveling, their path guided by familiarity rather than sight. The sound of hooves, soft and even, would blend into the quiet of the night, carrying forward the same gentle rhythm that had always been there. Or perhaps, for a time, everything had come to rest. Letters waiting in small places, riders paused between journeys, the world itself holding still just for a moment before continuing once more. Because nothing truly stopped, it only moved in cycles, writing, sending, waiting, receiving, remembering, and then again writing, always returning, always continuing, like the slow turning of the days into nights and nights into days again, like the quiet shifting of seasons, one blending softly into the next, like the steady road stretching endlessly forward, never hurried, never still for long. And within that endless gentle movement, the act of waiting remained unchanged, not heavy, not restless, but calm, patient, certain in its quiet way, a part of life that did not need to be noticed to exist, a presence that remained even in silence. As the night deepened further and the last traces of light faded completely, the world seemed to settle into its most peaceful state. Nothing called for attention, nothing needed to be done. There was only stillness, only quiet, only the soft continuation of everything that had always been. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of sight or sound, another letter moved forward, slowly and steadily along the same endless path, carrying with it a voice, a thought, a simple presence, on its way as it always had been, on its way as it always would be. And in that gentle, unbroken rhythm, the story did not end. It simply faded, softly, into the quiet.